And there's a lot of myths, a lot of misinformation about ranked choice voting, that a lot of scare tactics around it, and it's just not true. The voters love it. It's simple, and it would solve this vote splitting and unintended consequence problem that we have.
Hello and welcome to Vet Our Democracy podcast, created by us, the nonprofit, nonpartisan, pro-democracy group, We the Veterans and Military Families. In this series, we explore what it means to be a citizen, what veterans and military families' roles are in supporting and defending our Constitution following military service, and how you can get more involved to help create a more perfect union. We're all in this democracy thing together, and it's important for all of us to know our rights and our responsibilities to each other. As citizens, we need to know how our government is supposed to work so we can engage patriotically and positively to help bring about the best version of America. If you care about America, democracy, baseball, mom, and apple pie, then this is the podcast for you. We've all heard about how divided America is today. At least that's what we're being told. You only need to watch 5 minutes of cable news and you'll hear about how one political party is trashing another, calling them the enemy or a grave threat to democracy. Voter enthusiasm for leading candidates is low, and many people I speak with out here in rural Virginia are asking if these two very old male candidates are the best options our country of more than 330 million can produce. The last Congress was one of the least productive in terms of legislation passed in decades, if not U.S. history, because of partisan infighting and a lack of willingness to compromise. Many times, I feel like both of the major political parties are standing on opposite ends of the football field, hurling insults across to the 50-yard line at each other instead of doing the business of governing. What's clear is that Washington isn't going to change itself, and it reminds me of what Dr. W. Edwards Deming said, "A bad system will beat a good person every time." Today's episode is all about making the way we elect our officials better and how improving the system can produce a better politics for our nation. So joining us today are two guests that have a few ideas on how to do this. Navy veterans Todd Connor and Eric Bronner. Todd's the founder of Bunker Labs. He's the entrepreneur in residence at the University of Chicago's Booth School. He's a presidential leadership scholar and author of Third Shift Entrepreneur. And Eric is the co-founder of Show Me Integrity Education Fund in Missouri. He holds a JD from Washington University in St. Louis, and he's a nationally recognized election reform leader. They both have co-founded a group called Veterans for All Americans, formerly called Veterans for Political Innovation, whose mission is to build and mobilize a community of military veterans to advocate for election innovations that unlock competition, make our politics less toxic, and our government more effective. Gentlemen, welcome. Let's start off by telling us where you are on this snowy morning.
Hey, thanks for having us, Joe. I'm in St. Louis, Missouri, which is very cold and very snowy today.
Awesome. So Eric's in St. Louis, and Todd, where are you?
Yeah, good morning, Joe and Ellen. Great to be with you. I'm in Chicago, Illinois, Hyde Park neighborhood, south side here. Yep, and it's very cold.
We'd have to roll the dice to see who's got a lower outside temperature and greater snowfall. We actually have a couple inches here in Virginia, so which is unusual. But and Ellen, you're down in Norfolk.
Not down here. No snow. And
Okay.
yeah, no, probably some rain today, but so my kids are bummed out.
Awesome. So my first question for both of you is take us back to the beginning and tell us how your organization came to be.
Eric, take it away.
Sure. Yeah, so I'll start. So I was working in the reform movement here in Missouri and St. Louis with an organization, cross-partisan organization called Show Me Integrity. We helped pass a nonpartisan approval voting system in St. Louis City. I worked on that campaign, gathered signatures, and in November of 2020, we were successful. 68% of St. Louisans voted to change their structure of how they do their elections in St. Louis City to allow for more competition, to allow for a more representative outcome. And it was really inspiring for me personally to see this success on a local level amidst the dysfunction and chaos on the national level. It was such a stark contrast. And a veteran saw my passion for the work and said, "Eric, you should do something to get more veterans involved." I thought it was a good idea. I wish I had it, and kind of put together a kitchen cabinet, a kitchen council. Todd Connor was on that kitchen cabinet of veterans from all over the country. Dan Biga, our other co-founder, and many other just great veteran servant leaders helped invest in, is there a need for this, for another veterans organization? And there was. We found a true white space between the 40 or 50,000 veteran service organizations and the 10,000 or so reform organizations, there was a white space. No one was bringing those two worlds together. So we launched a little over 2 years ago as Veterans for All Voters.
Awesome. And then Todd, how did you meet Eric? How did you get involved in all of this? Because I know you and I go back probably almost 10 years to your days with Bunker Labs. And it seems like you're taking business savvy and bringing it towards the democracy space.
Well, yeah, I think we all have our story about how we kind of have pivoted into this work. And I think if you have been an American and you've been paying attention, and then in particular, if you're a military veteran, and you care about the country, I think you just can't help but ask yourself the question, what is going on and how do we get this thing back on the rails? And so I think I just like all of us and many other veterans I know have been asking ourselves like the sincere question, like what is going on here and how do we get it back on the rails? And I think for me, having had a long history in politics, I've attended 2 Republican conventions, I've attended 2 Democratic conventions, I have run for office, I've voted, I've been a poll worker, I've knocked doors, I've done all the things you can do institutionally. And I think after 2016 and then after 2018 and then after 2020, I really was trying to ask myself, this is what it was for me. The answers about what's wrong feel dissatisfying. Like I actually don't think that we're onto a more intellectually honest answer about what the problem is and how we get back to some semblance of normal governing power. And for me, normal governing power means healthy tension amongst different ideological viewpoints, but towards a system that amidst that tension gets things done. And what we have is a system with tension that does not get anything done because it's a winner-take-all environment, and both political parties operate sort of in a spirit of power for the sake of power. And so that crippling nature to me felt exhausting. And after 2020, I stepped down as CEO of Bunker Labs and really said, we have to. I think if you're middle-aged and you're a veteran, you've got some time, capacity, resources, whatever, and you feel and you self-identify as a patriot, you have to figure out how do you show up in this moment. And that question, which I probably ask every 5 or 6 years of my life, led me to reading a bunch of books, really trying to get grounded in like what's an honest answer about what's going on, how do we get ourselves out. And then read The Politics Industry by Michael Porter out of Harvard Business School and Catherine Gale, and really felt like it really had some searing insights about the dysfunction that we exhibit in our political system. That led me to reach out to Eric Bronner, who was already talking about election reform. And I said, I really think this is the first thing that intellectually feels honest to me, that like if we actually change laws about how people get elected, you get different incentives for how they behave. And we have evidence that this works in other countries. We have evidence that it works in some states in the United States. But fundamentally, it was like I stopped believing that this was just a behavioral thing of like we just need to beat the other side, and started believing that it's just an incentive problem. And so what are the incentives for our elected officials, and how do we change those incentives? If we can do that, we can begin to kind of get America back on the rails. And so that's what we've been doing these last 2 years.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I mean, in a capitalist system, right, we put $1 in front of it, we get it. And so, when you talk about incentives, I think incentives are everything. But Ellen, I think you wanted to ask.
Yeah, so Eric, going back to the beginning, so you were initially obviously working in St. Louis, kind of starting as local as possible. What were the reforms you were initially looking for? What were you advocating for in St. Louis first?
Sure. So Show Me Integrity is a good government organization. So, a more open, transparent government, but specifically, right, getting rid of partisan primary elections. Having St. Louis was one of only 20% of municipalities that still have partisan primary elections. There is no reason, from our perspective, there's no reason to have partisan primary elections at any level, but especially not at the local level. Why should school boards be partisan? Why should local government be partisan, right? So the old system was having unintended consequences in St. Louis, where in a majority Black city, we kept on electing white mayors because of the partisan primary system and plurality voting, first past the post, right? So you'd have 3 white candidates for mayor and 1 Black candidate. or vice versa. Sorry, 3 black candidates for mayor, 1 white candidate, and the black candidates would split the vote, and the white candidate would win. That's an unintended consequence. It's an unrepresentative outcome, right? So we were trying to make on a local level, let's make our democracy more representative. And that's the thread that carries through all of our work with Veterans for All Voters.
That's really cool. It's a great example at the very local level. And then you guys as an organization are sort of pulling that out, extrapolating that out to the country. What's sort of your parallel example right now, for our national politics, that 3 black mayor candidates to 1 white candidate? Like, what's sort of the parallel example that you're trying to address on the national level?
Sure. Well, it happens all the time, right? We're in presidential primaries, especially, right? You have a crowded primary field, and we're ending up, right? We're ending up with 2 leading candidates that 62% of Americans do not want, right? And that's a systems failure that can be addressed like this with system level changes, such as majority choice voting methods like ranked choice voting or others.
What's that? Explain ranked choice voting.
Yeah, ranked choice voting, it's a majority choice voting method, sometimes called instant runoff. We like to point out there's 6 southern states that already use ranked choice ballots for military and overseas voters. So this is not something foreign or to be scared of. It's not a Trojan horse for one party or the other. It's simply a way for voters to rank their choices. And if no one gets over 50% of the number 1 rankings, there's an instant runoff until you have a majority winner. And it's really very simple. Voters love it when it's used in states like Maine and Alaska. Utah uses it in over 20 different municipalities. And there's a lot of myths, a lot of misinformation about ranked choice voting, a lot of scare tactics around it. And it's just not true. The voters love it. It's simple, and it would solve this vote splitting and unintended consequence problem that we have.
So in other words, instead of just filling in 1 oval on my ballot, I'm just going to put, like, if the 4 of us were running for office, I would put, you or Todd as number 1.
No.
And then I would rank Ellen number 2, maybe I'm number 3. And so if no candidate gets more than 50% of the vote, they drop the lowest ranking candidate and then reapportion those votes to now the number 2 choice counts, right? Yeah, it doesn't seem that hard or complicated. But what does it get us, though? Like, how does that drive politics to the center instead of to the fringes?
Yeah.
So here's the most immediate. Sorry, Todd, and here's the most immediate positive benefit. Negative campaign ads are rendered unnecessary and ineffective. Negative campaign ads in a ranked choice voting election, they don't work because you want to be everyone's second choice if you're not their first choice. Todd, did you have some other thoughts about it?
Yeah, I would go back to like a fundamental premise, which is we have minority rule in this country. We have a minority of residents that are picking our majority representatives. 87% of districts in this country are either gerrymandered or geographically self-sorted. Even if you get rid of gerrymandering, it's still something like high 70% of districts are geographically self-sorted. Democrats live in cities, Republicans live in rural communities. That's just the way it's going to be, which means the winners of those elections are not determined in the general election. The winners of those elections are determined in the primary election. They're determined within the Republican race. We just had the Iowa caucuses yesterday. 110,000 Iowans voted, less than, in the Iowa caucus. There are 3.2 million people that live in Iowa. So the story is being spun as, Trump got 51%. It's, he's walking away with it, but like, let's just do the math. 51% of 110,000, let's call it 50,000 and change voters in a state of 3.2 million people are determining what becomes the narrative of who the objective front runner is in the Republican primary. The math just doesn't work. Like these are like minority elections. I'm like, why are we giving 50,000 people the power to say this is what a state wants when there are 3.2 million people in that state? So in most elections, in this country, the winners are not determined in the general election. And that's a problem because that's where the independents can vote. So if you're a registered independent, you cannot vote in the Republican primary or the Democratic primary. And that's where the Democrat or the Republican is emerging into the general election. And then in the general election, it's a fait complete because it's either a Democrat or a Republican district, right? So we just fundamentally don't have competition. So ranked choice voting is a mechanism, but it's not the point. The point is we have minority rule, and you can win a mayoral election or a congressional election by having 7 other candidates in the field and getting 22%. And you can win that primary with 22% in a Republican primary that already represents a minority of people in your district writ large. The 7 or 8 people that ousted McCarthy, I think only one of them was a majority winner in their election. So these people are minority rule in their own districts and then hijacking the United States House for their own ideological purposes, and then exercising like outsized power. So what we're proposing is like give power back to the majority. But in order to do that, you have to have mechanisms like ranked choice voting, and you also have to allow registered independents to fully participate. But like America hasn't lost its mind. America just doesn't get to participate. That's kind of our premise. America is very rational. They know this doesn't make sense. They don't want this rematch. They don't want the House of Representatives being hijacked. They want our political leaders to reach across the aisle, get things done. But the incentive structure is misaligned. So we just have to fix that alignment. And here's the final thing about this work. You can't go to the U.S. House of Representatives and ask it to fix itself. It can't.
Right.
Like these folks cannot fix themselves. This is like, it happens in the state legislature. It happens in states. Every state determines how they elect their U.S. representatives, and every state does it differently. That's just like what shocks people. Like the way that California elects senators is different from how Illinois does it. It's different from how Arkansas does it. So every state has the authority to change how they elect their federal representatives, and they can do it. And states are doing it. And if you want different outcomes in the United States House of Representatives, you have to go to state capitals. You don't go to DC. This work is not in DC. This work is in the 50 state capitals around the country. But I'm optimistic. We can fix it. But we got to first get clear with the American people, like what exactly is broken. What's broken is minority rule and political manipulation of the primary system to keep themselves in power.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I mean, in other words, I mean, really, we have 2 private clubs that are called political parties are really the only ones offering up candidates. And as a registered independent, if I wanted to run, man, it is so much harder for me to even get on the ballot, right? You know, even in some states, like the number of signatures that you need as an independent or some like, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times greater than if you're affiliated with a political party. So, Todd, you made a comment, we would never allow a monopoly or duopoly in business. I remember you said that over at Brookings this fall. Like, why would we allow it in politics? Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because, I mean, I'm fascinated with kind of bringing entrepreneurial ideas to improve our politics.
Well, what's funny is like if you work in politics, and this is the whole political industrial complex, and someone else actually said it's the political industrial entertainment complex, because we also have a news. This has become like a national sport for a lot of people. Like they watch just their cable news show of choice at night, which is also problematic. So this is an industry that's going to spend over $1 billion in this next presidential election. And it's dominated by 2 political parties. If you actually take a fresh look at this industry, if you don't work in it, what you realize is like something very obvious, which is we live in this capitalistic society where we expect choices everywhere we go. We go to Whole Foods and we see 12 different flavors of peanut butter. We expect, lots of American vehicles that we can choose from. Between our university system is full of choices. Like we expect choices all across our capitalistic society. But when it comes to the political system, we have told ourselves a narrative, and the political system has told us this narrative, that this 2-party system is somehow immutable, exempt from the rules of nature, wholly different, cannot be understood in the context of other countries, cannot be understood in the context of like free competition. And therefore we're just subject to sort of its rules. And the reason duopolies are illegal in this country, we regulate them because duopolies set prices and they manipulate consumers because they can have full authority and they can manipulate the marketplace. And that's why duopolies are illegal. Now, this is an unregulated marketplace. It's a political economy. It's an unregulated marketplace. But if you want to stop the abuse of consumers as measured by Americans not wanting this rematch, as measured by registered independents not actually getting a vote, even though these are taxpayer funded elections, you have to get back to a place where we don't have a two-party system sort of manipulating what happens. And we're not proposing getting rid of the two parties. I mean, I'm a member of one of these two parties. I'm dissatisfied, but I'm a member. That we need to have more, and we need to right size the relationship of the political parties to the governing environment. They are not one and the same. We have to have multi-party democracy in this country. We need strong political parties. The political parties that we have right now are being manipulated by their own ideological impulses. So they're not even strong as it is, but they are still sort of in control, manipulating the system. So we would not accept a duopoly we wouldn't accept there being only two mattress companies in this country. We wouldn't accept there being only, two grocery store chains in this country, but we somehow are subject to this. And it just fundamentally lacks in a country of 340 million people. We do not represent the diversity of interest, particularly the local interests that people in this country have. So we got to get past that. And it's just a system view. And by the way, I'll say this, historically in this country, every 70 years or so, we go through these sort of self-corrections. The reason we got direct primary elections in the 1920s is because party bosses were manipulating the primary process, the caucusing process, to just give favors back to people that got on the general election. So the American people rose up and said, we don't want party bosses in smoke-filled rooms picking our elected officials. And we got direct primaries in this country. We're just at a moment where we need to say, because power kind of encroaches on itself and it creates scaffolding to protect itself. And so that happens every 70 years. You got to pull that scaffolding down and give power back to people. So it's time in America to do this again. We've done it before. It's time now to do it again. We got to take the power back from the political parties in this moment.
It almost reminds me of something Churchill said, like he said, I'll always trust Americans to do the right thing after they've tried every other option, right? Know, and we're at that point now. I think you're absolutely right. Where people are tired of their government not working well for them. And Ellen and I are really trying to build up people's belief in the sanctity of the vote and how, as a voting volunteer, election volunteer, like the system, like when you cast your vote, it's definitely going for the person that you cast it for. What we're talking about here is kind of backing it up and what are the choices? Because a lot of times it's kind of it's the slight difference between Pepsi and Coke, right? You got two choices, but it's kind of you're getting the same thing at the end of the day in some sense, Yep. But Ellen, you had a question about.
Yeah. Well, so I was actually curious while you guys were talking about, first of all, are there other countries that we're, friends with, allies with, mm-hmm. that do ranked choice voting and have success with it? Obviously, there's a lot of different systems out there of democracy. My second question is how this all ties to voter participation. I mean, when you say those numbers about Iowa, 50,000 people out of 3.2 million, theoretically, if half Iowa is Democrats and half are Republicans, you would have much bigger numbers if everyone voted, right? So how does this tie to, I mean, of course, maybe people are more interested if they feel like they have more choices. Do you think that these systemic changes do increase voter participation?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, again, I operate from the global belief that it's the mechanics of election systems that have an outsized impact on the outcomes, how people participate, and everything else. You kind of have to operate from that premise belief that where you put the gum at the checkout counter is going to have an outsized impact on the amount of gum that you sell. That the system design, the stuff that is non-ideological turns out to be hugely impactful for kind of the decisions that people end up making in the political context. And there's lots of dysfunctions to this. One of the main dysfunctions has nothing to do with our politics, but is binary decision making. When there's only two choices on a ballot, and this is the Coke Pepsi analogy, the quickest persuasion path is not to make affirmative arguments for why I'm good. It's just to tear down the other thing. I don't need you to like me. I just need you to hate that. And that is sort of the net fuel of any binary decision. Now, and that's why Coke and Pepsi had negative campaigns all throughout the 90s. The minute that you have flavored water, it's all of a sudden a very dumb strategy for Coke and Pepsi to spend money going negative on each other, because what they realize is that they tear down the whole category. Now, no one likes Coke or cola. It's like the whole category gets hurt. So when you introduce competition, you can change things pretty quickly. And with voters, here's the big idea with voter turnout. It's not that voters don't know how to vote. It's not that they aren't civically minded. The next generation of voters is very engaged. What they are making is a rational calculation to say, what I want isn't going to get expressed through this election, and so I'm not sure there's a reason for me to vote. And they are not wrong. They are not dumb. And it's not just it's not a voter education campaign that's holding them back. They're fully informed. They know in Iowa that the polling indicates it's Trump's to walk away and it's freezing out, and you know, like if he's my guy, maybe I show up. If he's not my guy, I'm not sure it matters. So when you open up election systems and create real competition and you have choices, imagine going to the ballot and being excited because there's a few people that you like and you can't decide who to choose between. I mean, that seems like just a pipe dream in America, but it's true in other countries. And so we do know that ranked choice voting and majority election models where you have multi-party democracy increases voter turnout, increases minority representation, increases female representation, increases ideological diversity, increases moderate voices, which, by the way, are sort of summarily excluded from today's political environment. And the punchline is people will vote if they have a reason to vote. So we don't just need to and I actually get a little prickly on the Democratic Party in particular talking about we need to mobilize young people, because it actually blames young people and
blames young people for a very, very, very old guy.
It blames young people, and I'm like, young people aren't dumb. Young people know they are not happy with these choices. This is this is not a young people problem. This is not a voter education problem. This is a voter incentive problem. This is a choices problem. So if we fix the choices, people will show up, and there's lots of evidence. Last thing I'll say, because you asked it about globally, we're tied in the world with Chile in terms of the index of world's healthiest democracies. We're ranked 27. 8 of the 10 world's healthiest democracies have some form of majority election models, ranked choice voting. Our peer nations, when we go and do nation building in countries like Afghanistan, we always avoid an election model like our own and any sort of election model that leads to a binary outcome, because it's a ripe formula for ethnic conflict. You never want a binary decision environment, a governing environment that's only two. You want coalition tension, because if it's just good guys and bad guys, that's how we get world wars. That's how we get ethnic conflict. That's how we create moral degradation. So we always, when our own State Department goes abroad, we're always looking at how do you create coalition governing environments, multi-party democracy, and majority election systems that ensure legitimacy. Because the legitimacy questions come when 50,000 people in Iowa are determining what 3.2 million people want. Right. That's the legitimacy question, right? So we have to solve for that, and you can do it with election change.
Yeah, we don't see anyone rolling out the Electoral College as a way to set up new democracies in the world, right?
Eric, what were you going to say? Eric, what were you going to say about some of the EU countries? What are the other our peers that Todd just referred to?
Yeah, so Todd mentioned it, but specifically 3 out of the top 10 strongest democracies in the world, Ireland, Australia, and New Zealand, they all use ranked choice voting. Ireland and Australia have used it for about 100 years. And in Ireland, they still count the votes by hand. So again, there's so much misinformation about ranked choice voting and fear mongering, and it's not a scary thing at all. And it has a tremendous positive impact in other countries around the world.
And doesn't Australia have one of the highest voter turnouts in the world?
They do. They also have mandatory voting.
Mandatory, that's right.
You get fined if you don't vote. There's a couple countries like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was doing some research on this last week, and in the last election, U.S. Eligible voter turnout was 62.8%, something like that, which makes us 18th in the world as far as voter participation. So, next time people are talking about, hey, we're number 1, well, not in this category, right? But I think Todd's point's great because, it's almost like the psychology of joining groups, right? For me to join a group, I've got to see a little bit of myself there. I've got to see people who, look like me, espouse the same beliefs as me to kind of join that team. And yeah, wow, what a difference that would be if you had choices that you're actually excited about rather than holding your nose and picking the best of all worst options, right? So I think, you know, that's super interesting. And I think, the open, I want to circle back to the open primaries thing because, being an independent, if I'm in a state that's got closed primaries, I don't get a say of who goes on the ballot. And I just checked, Virginia's open, right? So like I can vote, and I think it's in one or the other party's primary, right? But not
Correct.
both. So I was kind of excited about that because it gives me a little bit of an option. But because if these political parties are actually private clubs, one, if they're having closed primaries, shouldn't they pay the cost of elections? Like,
Yes.
Why should the taxpayer, who isn't able to enjoy, the independent taxpayer who isn't able to enjoy voting in closed primaries, pay through their tax dollars to support private clubs selecting their own candidates, right? Could you tell me a little bit about how open primaries would force the conversation more to the middle and force candidates to the center?
Yeah, and Joe, you hit the nail on the head. That's one of our fundamental operating premises is that every single voter should be able to fully participate in every single public taxpayer funded election, right? And right now, 9 states have fully closed primary elections. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, 1.2 million independent voters in one of the most important swing states in our country can't even vote in the only election that matters in about 85% of the races is the primary election. So that's a huge problem, right? So when we move to the Alaska election model, so Alaska has a fully open primary, whereas an independent, you can vote for the best candidate for each office, regardless of party. I could vote for a Republican governor and a Democrat for lieutenant governor and a Libertarian for Secretary of State for each office, and then the top 4 move on to the general election, and you have real competition between four candidates. It just fundamentally changes how candidates campaign, right? Because they have to campaign to everyone. They have to reach out to all voters, and not just the most extreme party base is no longer the most important vote.
Yeah, it's funny. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and I remember my dad changed his voter registration all the time, back and forth, and weaving back and forth and back and forth, because he always wanted to be involved in the primaries, on one side or the other. And it was often, like you're saying, it was often to like maybe not vote, get the worst possible person to get less votes. I mean, but it's like so backwards. That's not what that's what voting should be.
Not at all.
Several friends run for the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. And as an independent, I just want to see the best person for the country win, right? And so, I told my friends, like, hey, I don't care if you're an R, I don't care if you're a D. I just believe in you as a good person and my friend, and I want to see you win this thing, right? And I can't tell you how many times, like, the political consultants would be like, oh, well, you can't say that because you'll lose the base. Like, you got to win the primary, so you've got to either adhere to this or say this or don't do this. And they're like, man, like, I don't believe that. And they're like, well, if you want to win over the base who are fairly extreme, then you're going to have to at least pretend to do this to win the primary, and then you can kind of tone it down in the general. And I'm like, what a horrible position to be in. And, forces candidates into this. They have to contort themselves, right? It's just kind of like there's no good options. And back to that Deming thing, like, no good person's going to withstand a bad system for long. So, like, if you want to win, it's almost like you've got to do the crazy person dance to get through the primary to actually be who you really are, if any of that remains by the time you get to the general. And I don't know. Do you see it the same way, or what are your thoughts about that?
Well, we know. I mean, we know it's true. If you spend time on Capitol Hill, you know that the verb that lingers in the nightmare of every incumbent is being primaried. It's not losing the general. Very few people in Congress they're not worried about losing to someone of the other party. They're terrified of being primaried within their own party. Like that's the whole game. And if you listen to a member of Congress, like that is what is sort of the fear. It keeps them up at night because again, we know this, the math says it. They're not in competitive districts against the other party. They are in competition within their own party. And the only way you're going to get primaried is if you don't perfectly toe the party line. And it is astounding, the voting records. And the last Congress was sort of set new records, depressing records in this way. But, members of Congress are voting with their party 97% of the time. It's like, we don't actually need a representative from this district. Let's just give the vote to, the Democratic leader or the Republican. Here, the vote is Hakeem Jeffries. It's not your vote. Because it's like, if you're a Democrat, it's like 97%. It's like, he's calling all the shots. Like, I don't even think it's fun to be a member of Congress these days. Like, this is actually what's depressing, is like, part of our appeal to members of Congress are like, don't you wish you could have original thoughts and not just have to be 97% in this predictable oppositional role if you're in the minority, or predictable, like, defend whatever's happening if you're in the majority role? Like, it's not, I don't even think it's fun anymore for a lot of members of Congress. And so part of our argument is like, this actually allows you, and if you look at Alaska and the representatives coming out of Alaska, moderate Democrat Mary Peltola, sort of somewhat moderate Republican Lisa Murkowski, conservative Senator Dan Sullivan, conservative governor, but they're all elected on the same ballot because voters are willing to be nuanced, and they think that these are the representatives that, like, will do the right thing for Alaskans, and they are willing to see past party. And as a result, their members are allowed to kind of operate with freedom when they go to the United States Senate and the United States House and say, well, I don't think this makes sense for us in Alaska. And it's frustrating to the party leadership, but it's exactly what their voters back home want. And so I think it's liberating for the right members, because the thing that, again, keeps them up at night is being primaried. And the only way to not get primaried is never take a vote that violates your party's dogma, and raise as much money as you can. And so that's why they spend most of their time doing exactly those two things, doing exactly what the leaders of their party want and raising as much money as possible.
Well, that almost sounds like we went back to party bosses, right? I mean, like, we didn't get too far away from it. We found a way back, or they have found a way back, if you will.
Yeah. Exactly.
If Washington's not going to fix itself, and it seems like states are starting to do this on their own, and I even saw, like, even local communities, right? Like how partisan politics usually hasn't been traditionally at the school board or the county commissioners. I read an article that was really inspiring in the Washington Post in November about Matthews, Virginia. Like, people so sick of, like, toxic partisan politics, that, like, local Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, they formed a pack over the summer and elected their own slate of people and threw out the extremists right out of county government. So, like, if the answer is not Washington, because you're really asking people in power, like, hey, would you like less power, more restrictions, and more uncertainty in your future? They're all going to say no. Like, that's just human behavior. I get that. So how do we get involved? Like, what do we do, and where do we do it to make this difference?
Yeah. Join us. Join us. This is a grassroots veteran-led movement, right? We have over 300 veteran state leaders now in 47 states. They're actively working on about 20 different reform campaigns, nonpartisan structural reforms. And it's just one more voice. Every voice we add to our team in these states is someone who can go tell their family and friends that both parties are gaslighting us, and leaders of both parties are gaslighting us for their own power and their own control. The only way we are going to change the system and make this country better is through grassroots citizen-led action.
And the optimistic tone I want to strike here is, because we've said what's hard, we've diagnosed the problem. Here's what's giving me optimism. Every state, like we said, can change how they conduct their elections, and tons of states are taking up the issue and saying, are we happy with the way that we are conducting our elections? And I got news for you. If you have a member of Congress who is in their 80s, or who has not had a meaningful competition in their primary or their general, like, you're part of the problem. You are part of the problem. You're, at least, what we can say at a minimum is you've figured out how to minimize competition, which, but every time you do that, I get offended, because it's like you're taking away choices from voters. It's not benign. What you're saying is, I don't want voters to have a choice because I want this for myself. And so we're denying voters, and there's so many symptoms of this: lack of competition in primaries, lack of competition in general, members of Congress that go on seemingly unabated for as long as they want, way beyond even the extent to which we know, like, it's open secrets that folks don't have full faculty. They're still there. Why is that? So it's an indication of a system failure, of a system breakdown. But states can change their laws. They can change how they elect their president. They can change how they conduct their elections for U.S. House, U.S. Senate. And we're seeing hotspots all across the country. Alaskans have really set the bar for the model that we think is most impactful. Nevada voters voted to implement the same model last cycle. They have to pass it twice. Both political parties were opposed because they couldn't figure out how they would manipulate it in a world in which they have competition again. So they were opposed, but we know that voters will support it again. There's a grassroots movement in Idaho to say we want real competition back in our elections. We want registered independents to participate. We don't want extremism. We want consensus-driven policymaking. And Pennsylvania's got an effort to open their primaries. Wisconsin's got a bill that they're moving through the state legislature. Um, and we could go through all the states, but there's lots: Colorado, Arizona, South Dakota. I mean, there are citizen efforts underway in all of these states and more. And I think we're going to see a lot more. So it can be a golden era for political innovation in which we restore and return power back to the people. But we, the people, and particularly we, the veterans, are going to have to be the messengers to make this thing happen, because Americans are not sure who to trust, particularly when you talk about changing elections. Both parties will say, well, this is complicated. They're trying to take away your elections. It's like, our elections have already been taken away. We're trying to actually give elections back, but we need honest brokers, trusted messengers, military veterans, spouses to help lead and be the tip of the spear of this movement, to tell Americans that we must expect better and we can have better, but we got to fight for it.
Definitely. Because I think, in our system, you brought up a thought, like, we the people are the final check on power, right? Like, so, I've heard it said that in a democracy, we always get the system of government that we deserve, or the elected leaders that we deserve. So, like, it's like, if you want a better politics, if you want to see less vitriol in Washington, then send better people to DC, right? But and I think, and as what I'm hearing from this whole conversation is kind of like, the system by which we elect people, if I cast my vote, it's getting counted, with pretty high fidelity. But it's like the choices I have, like the system by which we get to the choices that are actually on the ballot, is what really needs fixing. And I couldn't agree more. Absolutely couldn't agree more as an independent. And I think as a person that would like to be inspired by candidates, that wouldn't want to be like, oh, I'll hold my nose and vote for this person because at least they're not as bad as the other person. But we usually like to wrap up with a civics question. So our first episode, we challenged ourselves against the 100 practice questions for the U.S. citizenship test. And I pulled one out today. It was like, under our Constitution, some powers belong to the federal government. Name one power of the federal government.
Name one power of the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
To declare a war.
That's it. Yep. Bingo. Yep. Yeah. So to
regulate
money,
commerce,
declare war, create an army, and make treaties are the ones that would make you pass to become a U.S. citizen. So well done. So listen to episode 1. It was funny because, like, we struggled on some of them. Ellen and Jeremy and I. Ben was tossing some hardballs.
We all got one or two wrong. I'm not gonna lie. And, but we in the end we got enough to pass. But it was humbling.
It was humbling.
Yeah.
Well, we do need civics education. We do need, we need a lot more in this country. But we do need more. We do need more. We need a lot more in this country. We need a whole spirit of civic renewal. We got to remind the next generation that they, in fact, can control this government. But I think election reform is can be a big first intervention, an outsized intervention.
Yeah, awesome. Well, it's really compelling, and it's obviously, as a military spouse and veteran organization, we love to see, this kind of deep sort of political work done by our own community, right? Because it's the thinking, it's the strategizing that, it's all going to affect our military members in the long run, because if better people are making those decisions, then everyone's going to have it really helps us in an outsized way.
I totally agree with that. I want to say this too because this came up. The Republican senator from Alaska, Senator Sullivan, who really pushed Tuberville to end the what are
Yeah.
we calling it? The blockade or the
Blockade, right? Yeah.
and it's not lost on
Holds.
me that it's not lost on me that we had a Republican senator from a Final Five voting state who felt the freedom to stand up and say enough is enough to another Republican. And I'm like, if we want to incentivize that kind of truth telling to say, look, do not hijack the military because you have a pet issue around abortion, then we need more people that feel the freedom to do that because it's not going to hurt their own reelection. It's going to actually help their own reelection. I think another Republican senator from a closed primary state would have been primaried because that would have been sort of like you're entering that clickbait fray, right? In that cable news environment. I think the inverse happened in Alaska, which is like it fortifies his reelection as opposed to it hurts it. So to your point, Ellen, like this dysfunction isn't, it's not in the abstract. It's like we are not, national readiness is being hurt today. Military families are being hurt today by this congressional dysfunction. We're putting people in harm's way. Like it has consequences today for the military, for our national debt, for all kinds of things that, the federal government needs to do, frankly, and is unable to because of the environment in which it operates.
Definitely. Well, this has been a great conversation. I really, really appreciate your thoughts. I appreciate your time and being here on an early Tuesday morning. How can veterans who want to get involved find you?
Yeah, check us out at veteransforallvoters.org. Veterans for All Voters. We're real active on LinkedIn as well. If you have any interest in learning more, reach out to me or Todd on LinkedIn or via our website. We'd love to talk to you.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Any final thoughts from anyone?
Just thank you for what you guys are doing, Joe and Ellen. I mean, we're proud members of the We the Veterans Coalition, and it really is an all hands on deck. I would just challenge every veteran, don't get discouraged. I get it. The temptation is just tune out and like pretend like go live under a rock. That is what a lot of Americans are going to do, and they can't be. I don't blame them for wanting to do that, but I think we have a higher calling. We have to show up in this moment. My challenge to every person who's listening is develop your own theory of the case and then move to action against that theory. Find ways to be involved, whether it's volunteering as a poll worker locally, whether it's joining us, advocating for election reform. We all have a role to play in this moment, and we're actually not a huge community, but we need all the voices in this moment because Americans are wondering whether or not this thing's even worth fighting for. And I think the military community has to remind them that it is, and it's our systems, it's our generation's work to kind of repair the system for future generations. So I just encourage folks to stay optimistic and stay engaged.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
It's up to us.
Yep,
sure.
We agree. Well, thanks, guys. This was really, really, really awesome. Thanks.
And thank you so much for listening. Yeah, if you found this podcast or episode interesting or useful, please share it with the people that you know. This episode was co-hosted by Joe Plensler and Ellen Gustafson. The audio and video were edited by Cameron King. Better Democracy is a production of We the Veterans and Military Families, a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan, pro-democracy organization. We are focused on promoting a positive and patriotic civic engagement to strengthen American democracy. Find out more about us at wetheveterans.us and follow us on social media.